Hollywood sold them as saints, sirens, and sweethearts, but behind closed doors, many Golden Age actresses were foul-mouthed, sexually blunt, and shockingly unfiltered in ways the studios worked desperately to hide. Under rigid morality clauses and carefully staged publicity photos, these women swapped dirty jokes, cursed freely, drank hard, and spoke about sex with a candor that defied their screen personas. Memoirs and first-hand accounts reveal a private Hollywood far rawer, funnier, and more rebellious than the polished fantasy audiences were allowed to see. Mae West was the rare Golden Age actress whose private behavior and public persona were virtually identical. Long before Hollywood, she built her reputation on Broadway by writing and starring in plays filled with explicit sexual innuendo, frank talk about prostitution, and jokes so crude they landed her in jail on obscenity charges in 1927. When she arrived in Hollywood, West brought that same blunt, unapologetic attitude with her, openly discussing sex, ridiculing censorship, and manipulating studio executives with fearless confidence. Off-camera, she was known for profanity, ruthless wit, and a total lack of shame about desire, aging, or power. Unlike her peers, West didn't pretend to be refined, she weaponized vulgarity, turning double entendres and sexual dominance into box office gold. Her humor shocked censors, delighted audiences, and permanently reshaped how female sexuality could be portrayed, on screen and off. Tallulah Bankhead was infamous in Hollywood not for discreet rebellion, but for flagrant, unapologetic excess. Off-screen, she cursed constantly, told shockingly obscene jokes, and spoke about sex with a candor that left even hardened industry insiders stunned. Bankhead was openly bisexual at a time when such honesty could end a career, and she refused to soften her language or behavior to please studios. Her parties were legendary, fueled by alcohol, drugs, and guests from every corner of society, and her sharp tongue spared no one. She delighted in shocking polite company, once remarking that she'd tried everything except incest, a line that followed her for decades. Despite studio attempts to rein her in, Bankhead remained defiantly vulgar, using profanity and sexual bravado as a form of personal freedom. Her outrageousness wasn't accidental, it was a deliberate rejection of Hollywood hypocrisy, and it cemented her reputation as one of the era's most fearless and scandalous personalities. Jean Harlow's platinum blonde bombshell image masked a far earthier private personality. Friends and co-workers frequently recalled that off-camera she was blunt, loud, and unembarrassed about sex in a way that startled people who expected delicacy. Raised in working-class environments before stardom, Harlow never fully adopted the refined manners MGM tried to impose on her. She loved crude jokes, double entendres, and locker-room humor, and she swore freely among trusted company. Unlike many actresses who carefully separated their private lives from their screen personas, Harlow often leaned into her own sexual reputation, mocking the hypocrisy of a studio system that sold innocence while profiting from erotic appeal. Her laughter was described as raucous, her humor intentionally shocking, and her conversations refreshingly honest. While publicity departments worked overtime to present her as glamorous yet respectable, those close to her knew a woman who rejected pretense and used vulgar humor as both self-defense and rebellion in an industry obsessed with control. Clara Bow, Hollywood's original it girl, terrified studio executives precisely because she refused to censor herself. Coming from a rough Brooklyn upbringing, Bow spoke plainly, swore freely, and joked about sex with a frankness that clashed violently with the silent era's demand for manufactured innocence. Off-screen, she was impulsive, emotionally open, and uninterested in pretending to be refined. Gossip columnists and studio fixers worked constantly to suppress stories about her partying, relationships, and blunt language, fearing she embodied everything moral guardians hated about modern womanhood. Bow didn't hide her desires or soften her personality, she laughed loudly, flirted openly, and mocked hypocrisy wherever she saw it. Unlike many peers who learned to perform elegance, Bow remained defiantly real, which only amplified her appeal to audiences and her danger to the studio system. Her so-called vulgarity was less about obscenity than authenticity, a working-class woman refusing to apologize for her sexuality or conform to Hollywood's suffocating fantasy of female purity. Joan Crawford cultivated one of Hollywood's most controlled and aristocratic images, but privately she was known for a far harsher, more abrasive manner. Biographers and co-workers often described her off-screen language as blunt, profane, and aggressively confrontational, especially when she felt challenged or disrespected. Crawford swore freely in rehearsals and meetings, delivered cutting insults with precision, and had little patience for anyone she considered incompetent or disloyal. This sharp tongue stood in stark contrast to the elegance MGM carefully marketed to audiences. Her intensity was fueled by insecurity and ambition. She fought relentlessly to protect her status and demanded absolute discipline from those around her. While some peers admired her toughness, others found her verbally cruel and domineering. Crawford's so-called vulgarity wasn't playful or bawdy like some contemporaries, it was weaponized. In private, she used coarse language and verbal aggression as tools of control, revealing a woman far more volatile and ruthless than her polished, glamorous screen persona suggested. Bette Davis built her legend not just on talent, but on an unfiltered mouth and a refusal to be likable. Off-screen, she was infamous for profanity, brutal honesty, and insults so sharp they became industry folklore. Davis swore freely, mocked studio executives to their faces, and verbally dismantled anyone she felt was mediocre or dishonest. Unlike many contemporaries, she didn't use vulgarity for humor or shock value, it was a byproduct of her impatience with hypocrisy and incompetence. She openly criticized co-stars, directors, and the studio system itself, once remarking that Hollywood was built on phoniness and fear. Her biting remarks, often laced with coarse language, earned her a reputation as difficult, but also deeply respected. Davis believed politeness was a waste of time if it interfered with truth. In an era when actresses were expected to be agreeable and decorative, her sharp tongue became an act of rebellion. Her so-called vulgarity was simply ruthless candor, delivered without apology. Katharine Hepburn's aristocratic accent and patrician bearing hid a personality that was famously blunt, profane, and irreverent. Among friends and colleagues, she was known to swear casually, tell dirty jokes, and puncture pretension with sharp, sometimes shocking remarks. Hepburn had little patience for social niceties she considered fake, and she spoke her mind regardless of rank, gender, or studio politics. Crew members often remarked that her language on set would have gotten other actresses reprimanded, but Hepburn's talent and box office power gave her unusual freedom. She delighted in using earthy humor to unsettle people who expected refinement, especially journalists and executives. Unlike performers who separated their private and public selves, Hepburn made no real effort to soften her off-screen personality. Her so-called vulgarity wasn't about scandal or excess, it was rooted in independence. She rejected the idea that women should be delicate, quiet, or polite to be respected, and her blunt language became one more way she asserted autonomy in a tightly controlled industry. Gloria Swanson, one of the most glamorous stars of the silent and early sound era, was equally notorious for her sharp tongue and merciless wit off-camera. While her public image radiated sophistication and elegance, behind the scenes she was often impatient, acerbic, and brutally honest. Swanson had little tolerance for nonsense, incompetence, or pretension, and she wielded her words like a weapon, cutting down colleagues, studio executives, and anyone who crossed her path. She was known to swear freely in private, deliver stinging sarcasm, and mock social conventions without hesitation. Her so-called vulgarity was not about crudeness for shock value but a reflection of her fiercely independent personality and refusal to conform to Hollywood's rigid decorum. Swanson's candidness made her both feared and admired in the industry, allowing her to maintain control over her career while projecting an image of polished perfection that masked a far more audacious, unfiltered personality off-screen. Ava Gardner was one of Hollywood's most sensual and candid stars, but her off-screen behavior often shocked those who expected decorum. Known for heavy drinking, smoking, and a fearless attitude toward sex, she was unapologetically blunt in conversation and swore liberally. Friends and journalists alike reported that Gardner's humor could be ribald and provocative, and she often challenged societal expectations of women with her frankness. While studios tried to maintain her glamorous, untouchable image, Gardner's private life was filled with colorful, sometimes scandalous anecdotes. She would openly discuss relationships, sexuality, and personal frustrations, refusing to conform to Hollywood's moralized expectations. This mixture of allure, wit, and fearless candor made her both irresistible and intimidating, marking her as a star who blurred the line between private audacity and public glamour. Gardner's off-screen vulgarity wasn't calculated for attention, it was an expression of authenticity, independence, and a refusal to be constrained by Hollywood's rigid image-making machine. Marlene Dietrich was celebrated for her glamorous, enigmatic screen presence, but behind the scenes, she was fearless, blunt, and often shocking. Fluent in multiple languages and fiercely intelligent, she used her wit to unsettle and amuse those around her, frequently swearing and making sexually frank jokes. Dietrich's private life was unapologetically open, she embraced her bisexuality, openly discussed desire, and often challenged the prudish norms of the studio system. Friends and colleagues remembered her as audacious, sarcastic, and unafraid to deflate pretension with biting humor. While her on-screen image suggested elegance and sophistication, off-screen she wielded language and sexuality as tools of independence and self-expression. Dietrich's so-called vulgarity was a deliberate contrast to Hollywood's carefully polished illusions, reflecting a woman who refused to be confined by societal expectations. Her boldness, irreverence, and sharp tongue cemented her legacy as both a cinematic icon and a defiant, unfiltered personality beyond the screen. Barbara Stanwyck was known on screen for her elegance, poise, and versatility, but off-camera she had a sharp, streetwise edge. Growing up in a working-class environment shaped her no-nonsense attitude, and she carried that bluntness into Hollywood. Friends and co-workers often described her as foul-mouthed, direct, and unafraid to speak her mind, even when it meant offending powerful studio executives. Stanwyck's humor could be biting, her remarks laced with sarcasm, and she didn't sugarcoat her opinions. Unlike many actresses who carefully curated a polite or delicate public image, she embraced authenticity, using coarse language and candid speech as expressions of strength and independence. Her so-called vulgarity wasn't intended to shock but reflected her practical, unpretentious personality. This toughness and verbal fearlessness earned her respect in an industry dominated by rigid studio expectations and cemented her reputation as one of Hollywood's most formidable, commanding, and unapologetically outspoken actresses. Rita Hayworth, Hollywood's glamorous, love goddess, was famous for her screen allure, but off-camera she was far more down-to-earth, and surprisingly bawdy. Colleagues and friends recalled her enjoying risque jokes, teasing companions with sexual humor, and occasionally swearing in private settings. While the studio worked tirelessly to cultivate her image as elegant and untouchable, Hayworth's private personality was playful, earthy, and unafraid of ribald humor. She could be flirtatious, sarcastic, and candid about relationships, often revealing a side of herself that contrasted sharply with the polished starlets audiences adored. Her so-called vulgarity was subtle compared to some of her contemporaries, yet it reflected an actress who valued authenticity and personal expression over rigid conformity. Hayworth's mix of glamour, wit, and private irreverence made her both relatable and intriguing, showing that beneath the carefully managed Hollywood image was a woman who laughed freely, spoke honestly, and embraced life with unabashed honesty. Lucille Ball, long celebrated as television's queen of comedy, had a private personality that was strikingly different from her on-screen persona. While audiences saw a lovable, zany, and often innocent character, off-camera Ball was known to swear freely, tell bawdy jokes, and display a sharp, irreverent sense of humor. Friends and colleagues recalled her as mischievous, bold, and unafraid to shock, often using coarse language to entertain or disarm those around her. Her comedic genius was matched by a fearless, outspoken personality that challenged expectations of women in entertainment. Unlike many contemporaries who carefully separated their private and public lives, Ball's humor and candor were natural extensions of her intelligence and wit. This blend of brilliance, audacity, and playful vulgarity allowed her to dominate both film and television, creating a legacy of laughter while revealing a side of Hollywood's golden age that was far edgier and more unfiltered than audiences could ever imagine. Carole Lombard, one of Hollywood's brightest screwball stars, was famous off-screen for her quick wit, fearless humor, and penchant for risque jokes. Friends and co-workers often recalled her laughing loudly at crude humor, making sexually suggestive quips and swearing freely in private conversations. While her on-screen persona showcased charm, elegance, and comedic timing, Lombard's real-life personality was far earthier and irreverent. She delighted in shocking socialites, journalists, and even studio executives with her blunt, playful remarks. Unlike many actresses of the era who carefully managed their public images, Lombard embraced her authenticity, using humor and vulgarity as tools to express independence and defy Hollywood's strict moral expectations. Her ability to balance glamour with bold, unfiltered personality made her both beloved and legendary, revealing that behind the carefully staged publicity photographs was a woman unafraid to be herself, laugh loudly, and speak frankly in a world obsessed with appearances. Paulette Goddard, remembered for her luminous screen presence in films like Modern Times and The Great Dictator, was equally notable for her off-screen candor and rebellious personality. While studios presented her as glamorous, polished, and refined, Goddard's private behavior often subverted those expectations. She was outspoken, witty, and unafraid to challenge authority, frequently using coarse language and risque humor in social settings. Friends and colleagues recalled her telling bawdy stories, making sexually suggestive jokes, and swearing with an ease that startled those accustomed to the carefully curated images of Golden Age actresses. Growing up in challenging circumstances, Goddard developed a self-reliance and frankness that became hallmarks of her character. She did not rely on pretension to navigate Hollywood's elite circles. Her humor and candor were deliberate acts of independence, a way to assert control in an industry that demanded women conform to strict moral and behavioral codes. Beyond the profanity and shock value, Goddard's so-called vulgarity reflected intelligence, confidence, and an unwillingness to apologize for her desires or opinions. This boldness allowed her to form genuine connections with friends and collaborators, often earning their admiration while unnerving studio executives. Ultimately, Paulette Goddard embodied the tension between public image and private reality in Hollywood, demonstrating that beneath the glimmering facade of glamour was a woman fiercely autonomous, witty, and refreshingly unfiltered, a true rebel of her era. Lauren Bacall, one of Hollywood's most iconic screen sirens, was equally famous for her sharp mind, commanding presence, and fiercely independent personality off-camera. While audiences adored her smoky voice, sultry looks, and sophisticated on-screen persona, Bacall's private life revealed a woman who was blunt, sarcastic, and unafraid to speak her mind. Friends and colleagues frequently described her as quick-witted and verbally fearless, often making cutting remarks or employing dry, pointed humor that could shock or amuse in equal measure. She was known to swear freely, challenge studio authority, and make sexually suggestive jokes in private settings, a stark contrast to the poised and polished image carefully cultivated for public consumption. Bacall's candor was not about attention-seeking or scandal, it reflected intelligence, confidence, and a refusal to be constrained by Hollywood's strict codes of conduct for women. Her irreverence and audacity earned her respect among peers and collaborators, allowing her to navigate the industry on her own terms. This combination of elegance, wit, and off-screen bluntness revealed a side of Lauren Bacall that few in the public truly saw, a woman who embraced authenticity, valued honesty over pretense, and wielded her sharp tongue as a tool of independence, cementing her legacy as both a cinematic icon and a trailblazer of personal freedom in Golden Age Hollywood. Greta Garbo, one of the most enigmatic figures of Hollywood's Golden Age, was renowned for her aloof, mysterious on-screen presence, but behind closed doors, she was far more outspoken, blunt, and occasionally shockingly coarse. While studios cultivated an image of ethereal sophistication and untouchable elegance, Garbo privately demonstrated a sharp tongue, biting humor, and an unwillingness to conform to expectations of female decorum. Friends and confidants recounted instances where she swore freely, delivered scathing remarks, and mocked social pretenses with a wit that could unsettle even the most self-assured contemporaries. Her approach to sexuality and personal relationships was similarly candid, marked by frankness and emotional honesty that contrasted sharply with her carefully managed public persona. Garbo's so-called vulgarity was less about frivolity or theatrics and more an expression of autonomy and defiance, a deliberate refusal to play the part Hollywood demanded of women. She valued truth and authenticity over superficial charm, using blunt language and biting humor as tools to maintain control in a world obsessed with appearances. This combination of glamour, intensity, and verbal audacity cemented Garbo as a legend, revealing a private side that was rebellious, intelligent, and unapologetically unfiltered, challenging the industry's notions of femininity and propriety while remaining eternally fascinating. Jean Simmons, often remembered for her ethereal beauty and angelic screen presence, was in reality far more earthy and outspoken off-camera. While audiences admired her as delicate and refined, colleagues and friends knew her as witty, candid, and unafraid to speak her mind, sometimes in ways that would shock studio executives. Simmons was known to joke about sex, tell risque stories, and employ profanity when among trusted company, demonstrating a playful side that contrasted sharply with her public image. Growing up in working-class England, she carried a grounded practicality and forthrightness into Hollywood, refusing to be bound by the artificial constraints of studio-imposed elegance. Her so-called vulgarity was not about rebellion for its own sake, but about authenticity. She navigated an industry obsessed with appearance by embracing humor, frankness, and sharp intelligence. Co-stars often admired her ability to remain genuine, witty, and assertive, even in tense or high-pressure situations. Simmons' candid personality challenged the traditional expectations of women in Hollywood, proving that beneath the polished glamour and angelic image was a woman who was confident, expressive, and unapologetically herself, a private life as compelling and dynamic as her performances on screen. And Sheridan, famously dubbed the "Boomph Girl" of 1930s and 1940s Hollywood, was celebrated for her sultry screen presence, but her private personality was equally memorable for its candidness, wit, and occasional vulgarity. Behind the glamour, Sheridan was straightforward, unpretentious, and unafraid to express herself, often using coarse language and risque humor among friends and colleagues. Her reputation for sharp-tongued sarcasm and playful irreverence contrasted sharply with the studio-crafted image of sophistication and allure. Sheridan was known to make bawdy jokes, discuss relationships openly, and challenge the expectations imposed by Hollywood's strict moral and behavioral codes, earning both admiration and occasional consternation from peers and executives. Unlike many contemporaries who carefully curated their public personas, she embraced authenticity, using humor, bluntness, and verbal audacity as tools to navigate a male-dominated industry on her own terms. Her so-called vulgarity was never gratuitous, it reflected confidence, intelligence, and a refusal to conform. This combination of glamour, boldness, and unfiltered expression cemented Sheridan's reputation as both a Hollywood icon and a woman who lived and spoke with fearless honesty, leaving a legacy that extended beyond the screen into the real, unvarnished world of Golden Age Hollywood. Hedy Lamarr, often celebrated for her stunning beauty and iconic film roles, possessed a private personality that sharply contrasted with her carefully cultivated screen image. While the public saw a glamorous, seemingly delicate star, those close to her knew a woman who was fiercely intelligent, outspoken, and unafraid to challenge social norms. Lamarr frequently used sharp humor, candid speech, and even coarse language in private, revealing a side of her that was witty, rebellious, and unapologetically direct. Beyond her verbal boldness, she displayed a remarkable intellect, co-inventing a frequency-hopping communication system that later influenced modern Wi-Fi and Bluetooth technology, a fact that underscored her capacity to defy expectations in multiple arenas. In social settings, Lamarr was known to joke about sex and relationships, tell risque stories, and shock polite company with her blunt honesty, demonstrating a fearless embrace of her own desires and opinions. Her so-called vulgarity was less about provocation and more about authenticity, reflecting a refusal to conform to Hollywood's rigid moral and behavioral codes. Lamarr's blend of beauty, brains, and audacious candor allowed her to navigate a male-dominated industry with independence and wit, revealing a golden age star whose off-screen persona was as compelling, daring, and unfiltered as her life's extraordinary achievements. Thelma Todd, a beloved comedienne of the 1920s and 1930s, was often remembered for her effervescent screen persona and sparkling comedic timing. However, behind the camera, she was far more candid, bold, and outspoken than audiences realized. Todd was known among friends and colleagues for her sharp wit, irreverent humor, and occasional use of profanity, which set her apart from the carefully polished images the studios demanded. She enjoyed playful, sometimes risque jokes, and was unafraid to speak her mind, whether in social gatherings or on set. Todd's so-called vulgarity reflected a combination of intelligence, self-confidence, and a desire for authenticity, allowing her to navigate the pressures of Hollywood without succumbing entirely to its strict expectations of female decorum. While studios tried to maintain her image as glamorous and wholesome, those who knew her understood that Todd was witty, fearless, and refreshingly unfiltered, capable of blending charm with blunt honesty. This duality made her not only a talented actress but also a memorable personality whose private audacity added depth and intrigue to the glittering world of Golden Age Hollywood.